everybody. Our weekly look at engineering marvels is this week it's the Shanghai maglev train. I thought I'd thrown in enough civil engineering projects. I should finally do something that's related to mechanical, since a significant fraction of you are interested in mechanical engineering. This is a train that connects the airport in Shanghai to the city center. The stations are 19 miles apart. There's only 2 stations, a start and stop. And as you can see, some of the specifications there, it's one of just 3 magnetic levitation trains that have been in operation in the world, and it's the only one that's still in operation. It'll get you the 19 miles in just over 7 minutes, which is pretty fast. I don't know who's in such a hurry that 7 minutes is just barely enough. But anyways, I thought it's a pretty interesting project and has a lot of potential for longer distances. Interesting thing, when I was doing a little bit of reading about it yesterday, is of that ticket cost, $8.15, more than 70% of that they end up having to spend on electricity. So it's really highly expensive to keep that train floating above the tracks using superconducting magnets. Let's look at a couple of announcements here. First of them is that there's a tailgate party being held tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Just across the street, 3rd Avenue. It's going to be held on the west side of the engineering lab building. They're going to have free food and games. Hopefully it won't rain. So all of you are invited and encouraged to attend. We'd love to have you there. Also, the next quiz will open today once I have a chance to write up the questions and make it live. It'll be available through next Friday at 11 a.m. I'm really happy to introduce our speaker today, James Eddy Gray. He is the Chief Operating Officer at Triana Energy. He's got more than 20 years of experience in the energy business, and he's a licensed engineer in 8 different states. He actually has degrees in both civil engineering and surveying from West Virginia Tech. And he and I were talking to each other before the class started. He was mentioning that contrary to popular belief that maybe only petroleum engineers get employed in the natural gas sector, that actually they have a lot of mechanical engineers and civil engineers working for them, and there's a lot of money to be made right now in the gas exploration industry. So I'll leave it to him to tell you all the enticing details of a career in natural gas. Please join me in welcoming Eddy Gray.
Very good. All right. Thanks, everyone, for having me here today. And I've just gathered that there's multiple disciplines of engineering here, some mechanicals and civils. How many mechanicals do we have? Civils? Okay. And what other disciplines of engineering do we have here? Computer? Okay. One more? Electrical? Okay, good. Anything along the environmental engineering line? Okay, environmental, good. A couple more. Okay, very good. I'm going to talk today mostly about natural gas development and production. Primarily, I'm going to talk about what we call unconventional gas, and specifically about Marcellus Shale gas, because that's kind of the hot topic here in the United States today. So this here's just a little synopsis of what I'll talk about, a little bit about Triana, who we are, a little bit about natural gas history. We've got to have a history lesson in this. And then we'll talk a bit about unconventional shale gas, specifically Marcellus, and then we'll talk about the production process and where we see natural gas going in the future. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes. Okay, very good. Triana Energy, we're a small company, privately held, headquartered out of Charleston, West Virginia, and we've been around for quite a long time. Most of the management team there worked at a company called Columbia Gas that had a presence here in West Virginia as well as a few other states. We put a lot of focus on environmental and safety. In fact, we put an awful lot of focus on that. and you'll see some of that as I talk through what we do today. We're something that we are very proud of. We hold 2 certifications from the International Standard Organizations for environmental excellence as well as safety, and we'll talk maybe a little bit about that. There's two programs called one the ISO 14001, which is the environmental one, and then OSASH 18001, which is safety. So we are audited, if you will, by third-party auditors from a company called DNV, Det Norsk Veritas, out of Norway. So it kind of keeps us on our toes with respect to those 2 topics. This is some of the areas that we focus on today. Again, I mentioned our office is located in Charleston, and we do have quite a bit of operational activities in the Appalachian Basin here, up through West Virginia and Pennsylvania and so forth. We do have a presence in an office in Nova Scotia, and we do have activities currently going on in Romania as well as Australia. And this is just a little closer look of where we're operating here in the Appalachian Basin, primarily doing Marcellus Shale and or Utica development. Okay, time for the history lesson in oil and gas. If anyone here has ever looked at that or studied oil and gas, the Appalachian Basin here has a long history in both oil and gas. We read a lot in the history books that the first commercial natural gas well was in New York State, in Dunkard, in 1821. That's true. That's the first commercial well where the gas was actually sold to the town of Dunkard for heating. But really, just prior to that, in 1815, there was a natural gas well in Charleston, West Virginia, and it was actually used. The product was used. It was found during the drilling of the salt wells in Charleston, and they boiled the water to crystallize the salt, and actually the gas out of that well was used to do that. So, and there's a little monument. If anybody's familiar with Charleston, it's near Broad Street in Charleston. So I won't bore you with all this. The presentation will be available afterwards, but the one things that I will mention that horizontal drilling has been around for quite a while. We'll talk about it a bit today, but it was actually brought to the Appalachian Basin, brought to West Virginia here in a big way in 2006. We utilized horizontal drilling a little bit prior to that, back around 2000. But really it became very popular when the Marcellus kicked off in 2006. And then the first oil well was drilled in Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1859. And interesting enough, the driller, not the person responsible for it, but the driller on that oil well was the same guy that drilled the gas well in Charleston, West Virginia. So. Again, not the gentleman that was responsible for promoting and overseeing the project, but the physical drilling engineer is what we would call it today. Same folks. Okay, why natural gas? Why do we like natural gas at Triana Energy? Why are we highly focused on natural gas? You can see some of the stats here. Is a very clean burning fossil fuel, much cleaner than coal and some of the other things. A lot less emissions. And since 2006, and even the early 2000s, since we've started developing shale gas in this country, our methane emissions has actually went down significantly. You read a lot of stuff in the press today about folks flaring Marcellus wells and flaring shale gas wells and flaring wells out in the Bakken, in the Dakotas, and all these emissions going up. But our overall methane emissions is actually coming down quite sharply here in the United States, as you can see in that graph. Unconventional shale, that's something, and as I mentioned, the Appalachian Basin has a long history of gas wells. There's these shales that are very low permeability, low porosity. And for years and years and years, we've been drilling holes through them to get to other geologic formations. And we never could unlock the gas. We knew there was a lot of gas entrained in them, in the shales, but we never could get it out. But until recently, we've discovered the key, if you will, to get this gas out. And this is just a representation of some of the shale plays across the United States. And you can see here in the Appalachian Basin where it shows the Marcellus and the Utica. It's certainly the shale play that dominates everything in the United States. And again, this is a new discovery. And it's actually the second largest shale deposit in the world. This is a little graph here that shows the gas resource base across the world. And as you can see, we're second on the list, China being the first. China does not have any shale gas development. They're sitting on a large reserve, but the technology is just not there to be, for that extraction to take place today. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit more about Marcellus Shale. Marcellus Shale is just simply a black shale. It's an interesting rock. It's kind of soft, and it's a bit ductile. Offers quite a bit of drilling challenges, as well as challenges of how we get the gas out of it. There's a lot of gas entrained in it. When you drill a hole in it, it looks like you've drilled through a piece of glass. And make an analogy here. If you drill a hole through a piece of glass, it's pretty smooth. You don't have very many pores in it. Very low porosity, very low permeability, or the ability to gas to migrate through it. On the other hand, if I drill a hole in a piece of sandstone, it has a lot of big grains in it, so it has permeability. It has the ability for gas or a liquid to flow through a piece of sandstone. So in any event, the reason that we could never get gas out of these shales previously is because of that low permeability. So today we've developed some fracturing technologies that allow us to unlock that gas, and we'll talk about those a little bit. The two key components that allow us to get gas out of these shales is horizontal drilling. And it's pretty simple. The reason we drill horizontal is this shale package, the Marcellus Shale, may only be about 100 feet thick or 150 feet thick as we drill a vertical well down through it. So if we can get in it and drill horizontal for a mile or two, we got a lot more wellbore to come in contact with the surface. And again, the next thing is hydraulic fracturing. There's a lot of controversy over hydraulic fracturing today, of how bad it is and the constituents that we pump. But in reality today, we use about 99.5% fresh water and sand. We do use about 5% other additives, and we'll talk about those in a minute. There's a lot of misconceptions about those. This is a graphic illustration of 3 wells that we just came off of in Taylor County, West Virginia. If anybody's familiar with Bridgeport area, this is out of Bridgeport. Oftentimes we have these laterals going both directions, but this is a kind of a cross-section of what this may look like. When I talk about horizontal drilling, this is kind of a depiction. In years past, prior to the Marcellus Shale, we drilled one single vertical well on a drill pad. So you might imagine, we go in and we build a pad, a lot of civil engineering, we build a road to it, we build a drill pad, we drill one single vertical well, and then we have a pipeline coming out of there and so forth. And today, with horizontal drilling, we congregate several wells on a single pad. This representation here has only 3 wells on it. Most often we put 8 or 10. So we have 4 or 5 fingers, if you will, going opposing directions. And if I would look at it from the air, this is that same well site that has the 3 legs on it. These horizontal wells go out. They're about 1,000 feet apart. and they can range anywhere from a half a mile to 2 miles in length. Okay, just going to run through some basic steps summarizing what happens here during the development. We as an exploration production company, what our job is, what our role is, if you or someone owned a piece of property and the minerals under it, let's say a farm or a tract of land, we would come out and approach you guys and offer you a lease for the oil and gas minerals beneath it. And we would pay some dollar figure per acre for your property with a guarantee that we would drill within, let's say, the next 5 years. And then, so you would get a lump sum check for that. And then after that, if we drilled a well during that time period, then you would get some proportion of the royalty. Usually it's about 1/8%. And that equates to a pretty big amount if you're talking about a Marcellus Shale well. But in any event, that's the first thing that happens. And then once we have an area, site selection, the permitting, we use a lot of civil engineers in site selection, a lot of environmental folks with respect to permitting and where we put this thing, and so there's just a lot of activity associated with that. The second step of the process is drilling the well. Third step, completing, or what we call fracturing the well. And then we go back and reclaim the site and then produce the gas. And we'll talk about the production a little bit because we do process that gas a little bit prior to selling it. In the site selection, often we run seismic. I don't know if anybody in here is familiar with subsurface seismic. I always like to make the analogy it's nothing more than an ultrasound on the earth. We do a lot of things here today that seems fairly simple, but it's just on a large scale. So we have two types of seismic we run. One's called vibratory seismic, where we just have a truck that drives up and down the road. It stops, has a big foot that goes down and causes some vibrations, if you will. They're very, you can't feel them around, but they send sound waves down in the earth, and we have a lot of very highly sensitive recorders out around them that catch that signal when it comes back from bouncing off of the rock strata, and we can, our geophysicists can interpret that and hopefully tell us what depth certain rock stratas are, how thick it is, and they like to tell me that they can even tell us whether it has entrapped hydrocarbons or not, but I'm not sure I believe that. The other type of seismic is called cross-country seismic. It's where we actually go cross-country and we drill small holes, put off a small sound charge in the bottom of the hole, and we listen that way also with these geophones. That gives us a good picture of how the rocks are lying, and that allows us to focus where we want to place our natural gas well. Lots of other factors go into siting this well, and not only the geology, the rocks, but topography, because we've got to get roads in there, and so forth, and communities around there. One of the big things today, we'll talk about hydraulic fracturing. We put a lot of sand. I mentioned we use 99.5% of what we pump in the ground is sand. And I'm doing a pad right now that has 5 wells on it. It'll require about 40 million pounds of sand. So that equates to about 1,000 tractor trailer loads. So when we talk about road building to these Marcellus Shale pads, we build a pretty substantial road going in. So we have a lot of civil engineering involved in that. I mentioned impacts to the public, because if we're out in rural communities, it's quite an eye-opener when we send 1,000 trucks of sand in there. Lots of regulations. We are regulated, even though you may hear that we are not, and we just kind of do what we want to do. That's far from the truth. But this is a list of some of the regulatory bodies that oversee our operations. Again, a lot of civil engineering, a lot of design. Each one of these well bores that we put on a pad, I mentioned we'll put 8 to 10 well bores. Each well costs about anywhere from $8 to $10 million a piece. So if we put 10 of them on there, you know, at $8 million, we run up a tab pretty quick. The site itself and the access road typically cost anywhere between $1 and $2 million to build. So a lot of civil engineering involved, a lot of drainage involved and things like that to put in a well pad. Just some pictures here of typical construction activities. Okay, we'll move on to the drilling. We have two types of drilling that's primarily used for shale gas development. One is air drilling, and two is fluid drilling. I like to kind of make an analogy because most people are familiar with drilling a hole through a piece of wood. If you got a drill out there and you drill bit, you drill through a piece of wood, you get these wood cuttings that come up out of the hole. If you drill a real deep hole, you know, you got to kind of pull the bit up out of there once in a while to bring the cuttings up. Well, if you're drilling a hole to the Marcellus Shale, which is about 7,500 feet deep here in West Virginia, so it's about 1.5 miles deep, you get a lot of cuttings up out of there because we start with a pretty good size hole. We actually start with a 24-inch hole, and by the time we get to the bottom, we're down to usually an 8 3/4-inch hole, but still yet a lot of rock cuttings. So we have a drill bit that's usually 4.5 inches in diameter, and it's a hollow bit on the inside, and we force large volumes of air down that bit or down the drill string, comes out the bottom, and that helps lift the rock cuttings up out of the hole. So we typically drill what we call the vertical section of the well on air. We do that for a number of reasons. One, we can drill much faster on air than we can fluid, but we're going to be drilling through freshwater aquifers and things of that nature. So, you know, we want, again, to take a lot of pride in protecting groundwater. So if we're drilling on air and nothing but air, we're not introducing any chemicals or anything that might contaminate a groundwater aquifer. So air is very environmentally friendly, and then two, we drill faster. Once we get through all the freshwater aquifers, down to what we call the curve, the bottom of the vertical well where it curves and goes horizontal, we go over to fluid. Same type of drilling. Only thing is we force fluid down through the center of the bit, and the fluid helps carry these rock cuttings. And it is a pretty sophisticated process. The fluids are very expensive. They're synthetic, oil-based fluids. The cost of a drilling fluid to drill one well is typically about $500,000, and we use that fluid over and over again. It's recycled, so we rent it, if you will, and we drill a well, it's reconditioned, and we drill another well, and so forth. It does drill a little bit slower than air, has a bit more ability to lift the cuttings out of the hole. A lot of science goes into that, the viscosity of this fluid, the weight of this fluid, because it's also used to, when we get down in these heavy gaseous zones, it holds the gas pressure back in the rock formation to protect us at the surface. I mentioned we start out with a fairly large wellbore. We drill down, we've got multiple strings of casing and cement in a well. I'll talk about 3 of them just to kind of keep this short. The first thing we do is we drill down through the freshwater aquifers. Once we get about a minimum of 100 feet below the freshwater aquifers, we stop. And that's usually a 17.5-inch hole, and it's about 1,000 feet deep. In that 17.5-inch hole, we'll take a piece of 13 3/8-inch casing and put down in there, and that's, again, below all the freshwater, the base of the deepest freshwater. And then we pump cement down that 13 3/8-inch pipe, push a rubber plug down it, and it kind of squishes the cement out the bottom, comes up around the outer edge of that casing in the 17.5-inch hole. When we see that cement back at surface, we know we've effectively cemented the outside of that casing to the adjoining rock casing or the rock strata out from us. So rather than trying to drop cement in from the top, as you could imagine, you would never know if it got to the bottom or not. So we put that string of pipe in, and again, its job is to protect freshwater. The next string is a pressure control string. We come out of that 13 3/8-inch casing, with about an 11.5-inch bit, and we drill down to a depth of about 3,000 feet. Once we get down there, we do the same thing again. We'll put a piece of 9 5/8-inch casing in this 11.5-inch hole, and we'll fill it full of cement, pump a rubber plug down it till the cement comes back to the surface, and then we've got that pressure control string. So at that point, if you're looking at the top, you see cement out around 13 3/8-inch casing, and then another layer of cement with a 9 5/8-inch casing. We come out of that 9 5/8-inch casing with an 8 3/4-inch bit, and then we drill on down to what we call the kickoff point, where we want to turn the well. And it's got another piece of casing that goes in there. So again, multiple layers of casing. I've skipped a couple. There's actually about 5 as we get down here, but that's how we build the well bore, the well casing. Okay, I'm going to shut up about the drilling here for a minute and talk about the completion phase, or the stimulation. Believe it or not, all wells, about all wells, 97% of all wells in the United States, 97% of all the wells in the world are fracked. The fracturing does occur on those. Even the wells that I mentioned that was drilled in the 1800s here, they were fracked. A little more crude methods than what we use today. Those early wells that we talked about, the oil wells and so forth, was fracked with nitroglycerin. They actually dropped nitroglycerin in the well bore in tubes, and it would explode at the bottom, hopefully cracking the rock, and they'd get more oil out of it. Over time, they became a little more current and started using other types of explosives. And then after a while, they figured out if they would pump a gas in the ground at real high pressure, it would do the same thing as an explosion. And then over time, we figured out, oh, water is quite neat. We can pump water in the well, and we can cause these fractures. But more importantly, with water, we can carry a proppant out in there, and we'll talk about that a little bit. That proppant happens to be sand. This is a typical frac spread. You can see a series of engines, these gray engines out there. There's about 35,000 horsepower setting on there to pump the water and sand that we might use in a wellbore. In a fracking of a horizontal well, we don't frack if the horizontal leg is a mile long or 2 miles long. We don't frack all of it at one time. It's actually isolated in small sections we call stages. And each stage, we perforate the casing. And that, again, is a kind of a science in itself. We take a 2-foot section. We put some little small holes that are about anywhere from 1/4 to 1/2 inch in diameter. They're very perfectly shaped in size and position. There's typically, it ranges of how we do the pattern, but oftentimes there's about 24 holes in a spiral shape in a 2-foot section. And we call that a cluster, and we do that with what we call perf guns. It's small charges that we put down to drive a little round ball through the steel casing and cement and about 2 foot in the rock strata. And then we pump a high pressure of water and sand into that. The water creates these tiny little fractures, almost looks like a BB that's hit a piece of glass. Tiny little fracture network. And I mentioned earlier this Marcellus Shale is very ductile. It's kind of like clay to some degree. So if we create the fractures, let off the pressure, they're self-healing, because again, they got 1.5 miles of overburden over them. With all the pressure, they heal themselves. So we pump the sand out in there, and then when we let the pressure off, the water comes back to our wellbore, and the sand grains hold these little tiny cracks open. So that's how it works. We do one section, and we just start moving back and forth and back and forth. I mentioned here the hydraulic fracturing, but this is what a wellhead looks like when we're hooked up to it to pump the water and sand down there. It goes down at very high pressure, goes down about a little over 9,000 psi, which creates some challenges for the engineering community. As you could imagine, our concrete in the wellbores are about 3,000 psi, and then obviously steel. You guys will be studying that as you go through. So it creates a little bit of a challenge to get those high pressures because we pump a lot of fluid very quickly down the hole. Typically about 100 barrels a minute will go down this apparatus. And I'll mention this. I think I always thought this was quite interesting. You see the red and blue things that's kind of wound around the pipes. Those are Kevlar straps. Ever seen a water hose get loose in the yard and it's flopping around? Well, it's if you get a steel pipe loose at 9,000 psi, it's pretty violent. So those are just big rubber bands to kind of hold it down. The hydraulic fracturing process is quite simple. If you stand way back from it and look at it, you know, we've got water, we've got sand. We do add a few other additives. I'll talk about those in a minute. We put the sand proppant in. It goes through some big pumps, and we pump it in the ground till it cracks the rock. So fairly simple process, but it is fairly complex, the execution of it. The other things that's in a hydraulic frac, you read all kinds of things. You've heard all kinds of things that, you know, this stuff is so bad and it's going to kill everybody. Back when the Marcellus Shale development started, they used about a dozen constituents in the frac fluid, and there they are. And I can talk for hours on what they are, but they're very low concentrations. But things have improved over the past 4 or 5 years. Today, we pump frac jobs that only has about 5 things in it. I got a frac job that's pumping today. It has 5 things in it. It has water. It has sand. We treat the water before it goes downhole with a biocide, and it's usually chlorine or chlorine dioxide. Got a lot of chemists on staff that do that. Basically, we make drinking water before we pump it down the hole. And the reason for that is we want to be good stewards of the environment. If I pump surface water that I get from a river or a stream down in the earth that's 140 degrees, it's a perfect petri dish. So I can grow bacteria down there. So I need to disinfect that water. So again, I got the biocide, and then I pump something down there that's a friction reducer. This makes the water a little bit slick. Thus, we often call this slick water fracs. And then I'll pump a scale inhibitor so I don't cause scale to build up in my steel pipe. But other than that, that's about all that's in it today. It's very low concentrations. It's actually quite benign. When we pump, I mentioned that we create these perforations in the casing. Oftentimes we get into the adjacent wellbore and listen to what's going on there so we can tell how far are we pumping this water and sand. And this is an image that comes back. There's some very advanced computerized modeling that goes on real time in our directional drilling process, the way we steer wells, but also in the fracking. And this is just a representation of where that sand and stuff is going. And we call that microseismic, where we use some pretty advanced listening devices in an adjacent wellbore. Okay, after wells, we got a pad that's built, we got a well that's drilled, we've got a well that's been fracked. It's live and ready to go. In the Marcellus Shale, most of the gas here is we refer to as dry gas. It doesn't have a lot of other constituents in it, and we have to do very little processing before it goes to sales. It comes out of the wellhead, we run it through a water separator. Water goes to a tank. It's salt water primarily, and then the gas goes through a meter and then on out to sales. Now these facilities are pretty complex looking, but in the grand scheme of things, it's a fairly simple process. Some parts of the Marcellus up in northwest Pennsylvania or Ohio, in the Utica, the gas is what we call wet gas. The composition of the gas has a lot more heavy hydrocarbons in it, like butane, pentane, propane, ethane, and hexane, and some of those things, rather than just methane that's in the dry gas. So, so dry gas that we burn in our kitchen stoves and we heat with is primarily just methane gas. Has very low concentrations of anything else. Propane is nothing more than the same thing, has a higher BTU content, but it's basically liquid at ambient pressures. We burn propane in our gas grills and so forth. Butane, everybody's seen a butane lighter, it's typically a liquid. So if we're in a wet gas window, we do a little bit more processing to separate the propane, the butane, and then we sell that as a separate product. The produced water goes into a tank. For years and years, if anybody's been around seen old gas wells, they used to have these tanks, and they'd blow off the wells, and all the deer would come in and lick up the brine water because it's salt water. Anytime you drill a well down below sea level, above that, you'll get fresh water. Once you get to sea level, it's salt water. In fact, it's the same as you get at the beach. But in any event, the produced fluids that come from these wells, lots of regulations around the handling of those fluids and disposal nowadays. So they go in tanks, and then typically they go off for disposal most of the time now into Class 2 underground injection wells. Sometimes it is processed for other things. After the well goes in production, the pads get reclaimed, shrunk in size, and there's usually a wellhead and a couple tanks and a little unit out there we call a gas processing unit that separates the water from the gas stream and sits there and produces for the next 50 to 100 years. And I'll mention this because I don't know how familiar you guys, if anybody's seen a gas well before, but if University of Charleston back a few years ago in the early 2000s, I drilled a gas well on the campus of University of Charleston. Out, they had a little ball field down below the campus called Blackwell Field, and we drilled a shale well out on the ball field. And if you go there today, if you ever go there, there's a little thing that looks like a dog kennel. It's just chain link fence, and it's got a bunch of advertising on it, but that's actually a shale gas well setting in right on the edge of Blackwell Field. So if you're ever there, you'll see a sign that says Triana Field, but we drilled that well and then gave it to the college as a gift. So. Okay, a little bit of discussion here about natural gas consumption here in the United States. We today we use in the United States somewhere around 24 or so TCF gas a year, as you can see here, and you can see the breakdown. A lot of it's for the electrical industry, a lot of it's industrial, commercial, transportation, still pretty low on transportation here in this country, and then some burn for residential use. But you can see that continuing to grow here over the next few years. Marcellus Shale has created a lot of controversy here in the Appalachian Basin, but it's also done a lot of good things for us. I pulled some facts. It's a little bit dated from Pennsylvania here. In fact, it's 2009. This impact analysis was done by a few of the universities there. And there's some of the stats here on the economic value from the shale development in the state of Pennsylvania. And you can see the numbers there are kind of astounding as Marcellus Shale production took off from 2008 to 2010, and then what they project out in 2020. You can see the impact to the economics of the state, as well as the tax base and the total jobs created. I have a frac job going on today. There's about probably a little over 100 engineers on site or associated with that frac job out there. So it's a highly regulated activity with respect of oversight from the engineering community. It is an engineering activity. This used to be old wells and stuff. There are a lot of geologists and stuff involved, but today it's certainly an engineering activity out there. Another tidbit here in West Virginia. And again, I pulled this off of one of West Virginia's pages, but Marcellus development has added about $1.2 billion in revenue to the state of West Virginia since it started in 2006. And you can see what some of the estimates for wages will be achieved in West Virginia. Another thing I saw that I thought was quite interesting in Wetzel, Doddridge, and Marshall counties, the property assessment. I mentioned we go out and lease the property and produce the gas, but the property assessment more than doubled in 10 years. in the development of this. So it's certainly changing the dynamics of our communities. Another slide here, talk a little bit about the wages. In the natural gas community, you can see some of the jobs. There's some average salaries here that I pulled from a source called EIA, and they're usually a pretty good source and hit that. So you can see what some of the average annual salaries are in the industry today. Okay, I'll stop here. I've kind of glossed over a lot of things, but I'll stop and ask if there's any questions. Yeah, TCF, trillion cubic feet of gas. Mm-hmm. That's a good question. We measure gas in cubic feet, and there's a standard pressure that's not compressed. And it's just like if we think of a liquid of gasoline, you know, it's in it as a gallon, but it's pretty much a non-compressible fluid. So we have a standard atmospheric pressure for 1 cubic feet, and that's how gas is measured, and it's at what we call ambient background pressure. And so it's basically the same pressure that we're bombarded with in here. 1 cubic foot box of natural gas is a cubic foot of gas. Oftentimes we measure it in thousands of cubic feet, and you'll see it written as MCF. And then when we talk about millions of cubic feet, millions of those boxes, and then TCF, trillions of those boxes. Any other questions?
Has there been any instances when the casing fails and the gas is getting to the water supply?
Yes. Not so much of casing failures, and that's a very good question. The horizontal drilling and the casing and cement practices that's being utilized here today in the Marcellus is the most advanced horizontal drilling and casing practices anywhere in the world. And we've learned lots of lessons, but there has been instances where gas wells weren't cased properly, they weren't cemented properly, and it allows gas to migrate up outside the wellbore. And once it reaches a water aquifer, it just, you know, again, it can just run through that gas. So you'll see gas get into water systems. Now, it's very common here in the Appalachian Basin that there's some gas in most water aquifers anyway, just natural gas what we call background gas that escapes at the surface. But yes, if it's not engineered properly, it can cause gas migration. So one of the things, and I'll add to that, I didn't go into detail, but if you've got a lot of civil engineers in here, and you'll talk, you know, probably there'll be a class somewhere in your program or the time you're here in cement. And the cement that we use downhole, it's an art in itself. I mean, we have engineers that do nothing but design our cement jobs and design the mixes and different types of cement for the different applications. Injection wells, especially, like in Oklahoma, from 2005, 2010, I worked in Oklahoma quite a bit. When you're injecting fluids, what we call injection wells, there's been lots of cases of microtremors. Most of those were caused from, you know, our plates that's down there or rocks down there that's getting some residual stresses on them anyway. We're lubricating those plates, so they're slowly releasing that pressure, causing a microtremor versus building up for some number of years and eventually having an earthquake. We have had a few. I don't know if anybody here heard, but back in probably 4 or 5 years ago, Braxton County, West Virginia, had a series of microtremors, and they determined that the result of that was an injection well in Braxton County, West Virginia, where fluids was being injected. There was a lot of residual pressures in the geology, and it was relieving those pressures. But that the injection was stopped and the trimmer stopped. Probably not the best thing to do. It's probably in the overall thing would have been better to continue to do that and allow that pressure to be released slowly versus sometime in the future having an earthquake there. I remember that well. That was one of a well of Chesapeake Energy's up there. So. Other questions? Okay, that in itself is a whole discussion we could spend hours on, because we use some very state-of-the-art engineering to do the steering of the wells, especially when it's 1.5 miles deep in the earth. We can't really see where we are, but it's a lot of. We use what's called a downhole steerable motor, and I really today it's. A lot of it's done remotely. A lot of it's done from remote control, but we've got a lot of electronics. I heard some electrical engineers in here. A whole lot of technology related to communication down to a drill bit where we can actually change the direction of that bit and change the direction of the hole real time. Because it's not as simple as one might think, because as we're drilling through those rocks, there's little tiny cracks, there's little tiny folds in the rocks, and the drill bit wants to follow those cracks. So we're constantly steering that drill bit. And it truly is a science and an engineering art of how we determine where we are real time, because we may be out in a horizontal section that's 3 miles from where the drill rig is, and we're trying to stay within a 5-foot tolerance with that drill bit. So be glad to talk more about that, but we do that through, and again, a steerable, what we call a motor downhole.
Thanks again for coming to visit us. We appreciate your presentation. All right, everyone, that's it for this week. I will see you next Friday.
Does that work?
Yeah, it was really good.